All right, thanks, Rez. Yeah, I hope to end us off strong, and yeah, super excited to be chatting with you all today. It's good to see a lot of the community here in the chat. Some of the individuals as well. I know that's also been playing around with the topic I'm going to be covering today, and yeah, maybe even some of them will be actually able to answer some of the questions I get stumped with. Who knows? But yeah, so my topic today is going to be on powering up your plugins with dependent assemblies, which is a new feature I'm really excited to show you today. I was actually been working with this in the preview, actually early in the private preview. I was hoping to actually present on this during the last community summit, but the public preview unfortunately ended up getting pushed out, so I wasn't able to present on it, but happy to do so today now. So for those who don't know me, my name is Chris Piasecki. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta. That's in Western Canada. I'm a senior consultant and Power Platform architect working at CGI. And I'm also a Microsoft MVP in the business application space. I've got my QR code there. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, be happy to chat with you further afterwards. Feel free to just, when you're adding me, just kind of leave a note that you attended my session at the Dataverse Summit, so I know that's where you're coming from, or I know you're not a bot or something. Because sure get a lot of those spam type of requests these days. So on to today's topic. So, what are some of the key principles that us as developers really kind of strive to follow and live by? Jordy kind of alluded to some of them in his sessions, but, one kind of really major one is, don't repeat yourself, right? Duplicating code and redoing the same thing over and over again. And another kind of extension to that is a big one, which is don't reinvent the wheel, right? So, there's such a great community out there that's building all these awesome libraries that we can make use of in the open source community. And so really you shouldn't have to, reinvent the wheel, having to do all this, low level plumbing or code that we sometimes have to do. And the unfortunate kind of part with plugin development up until today is that having to develop plugins is really hard to kind of, align with some of these kind of principles, because as most of you already know, with plugin codes, you have to deploy the plugin assembly standalone as a single assembly. So all of that plugin logic needs to be kind of encapsulated or bundled all in with the same assembly. And as a result, you also only get a kind of a core set of the framework assemblies and some of the XRM assemblies that are available in the Dataverse sandbox runtime environment when you deploy your plugins. And so, some key limitations or some key limitations of this is that you're often having to either write this low-level boilerplate code in your plugins directly, hence reinventing the wheel, because you can't reference these third-party libraries or even your own code. If you do, though, have your custom code, sure, you can kind of add what's called a shared project inside of your plugin and compile it directly with the assembly. Though the disadvantage to that is, if you've somehow got different teams in your organization and you don't necessarily want to share out that code directly, with the same development team working on plugins, then that could be a disadvantage, and they might be able to make the changes directly, and you might have just inconsistencies with the behavior of that library, and can be more time consuming to troubleshoot. Or in many cases, which a lot of us are still doing today, is using unsupported or currently unreliable assembly merging tools such as ILMerge in order to kind of bundle those third-party libraries directly in and merge it as one single assembly that's deployed into the Dataverse environment. And this again, it brings its own set of challenges. It sometimes works, it sometimes doesn't, it can sometimes be difficult to troubleshoot. And again, as Microsoft doesn't currently support this, but yet, a lot of people still do this anyways, because it's just, the risk we have to take. And it's just in order to save us a bunch of, unnecessary coding. It's just kind of the risk we kind of have to assume sometimes. Well, the great news is that Microsoft is finally given us the answer to this. And now we can actually add dependent assemblies into your plugin projects. And what ends up happening is it actually ends up getting deployed as a NuGet package. So you're able to basically bundle in not just your plugin assembly, but also any of the third-party or other shared libraries that you're referencing inside of your project. Now what ends up happening is the NuGet package file itself gets stored in a new table called plugin package. And the actual contents of the NuGet package, like the libraries and such and the plugin, do end up getting put into file storage. So at least it's not contributing towards your expensive database storage, so which is nice. So in terms of what this kind of looks like now, so you have kind of two aspects to consider. So there's kind of the build artifacts that come out when you're developing your plugins, in your IDE. So previously, we only had to worry about the actual plugin assembly that gets deployed. But now when you build a package project, you now instead get a NuGet package as your build artifact. And in that contain your plugin assemblies and any dependent assemblies that you include with it. And when you end up deploying that NuGet package into the Dataverse environment, as I mentioned, it ends up creating a entry in that plugin package table, and it ends up creating a new solution component called a package or a plugin package. And alongside that also includes your plugin assemblies. Once that's kind of been deployed, then you can now go ahead as usual and register things like plugin steps, and inside of those plugin steps, including things like pre and post images, and so on. So there are two ways that today that Microsoft has provided for us to create plugin projects and then deploy them to Dataverse. And the first one is through the PAC CLI and the plugin registration tool. So this approach is a more command line based, as we're using the PAC CLI to initialize and create the plugin project. There's some minimum version requirements in order to do so. So you need a minimum version of the CLI to ensure that it creates the plugin project with the necessary bits in it to automatically create those that NuGet package when building. And then as well, you need a certain version of the plugin registration tool in order to actually go in and register and view and just manage the actual plugin packages once they're deployed. And so, as I mentioned, you end up deploying those packages via the plugin registration tool. The second method we have is using the Power Platform Tools extension for Visual Studio. So this will kind of allow you to do this in a more GUI-based fashion directly in the IDE. It does currently require Visual Studio 2019 because the Power Platform Tools is only supported on that version at this time. So 2022 is not quite yet. Hopefully it will be in the coming months, but as of right now, you'll have to use Visual Studio 2019 to leverage that extension. And then you're actually able to deploy the packages into your Dataverse environment directly inside of Visual Studio. And I'm going to actually demo both of these approaches for you today. And so with that, I'm going to just exit out of my slides now, and we'll actually jump right into a demo. And so let's kind of just walk through the setup for today's demonstration. So I'm going to just hop over to my Maker portal. We have just a very simple solution in place here. So we have two tables here. So we have the out-of-the-box user table, and inside of that, we've added a couple of custom attributes. We've added the department, the office location, and then we've added a plugin trigger. It's a toggle, which is just going to be used to make it easy to demonstrate the plugin functionality in action. And so what we want to actually do is we want to get the department and office location inside the user's profile by reading the user's information from their M3 or Microsoft 365 profile using the Graph API. As we know, today out of the box, you only get a certain amount of attributes automatically synchronized when the user gets created. And so if we're going to demonstrate getting those additional attributes, because I actually see this as a common requirement. Now, of course, we probably well know that we can likely achieve the same sort of scenario that I'm talking about using Power Automate, but for the sake of demonstration of today, let's just ignore that fact, and we're going to do it using a plugin leveraging the dependent assemblies. We also have an additional table called Graph Configuration, and this is just so we can authenticate to the Graph API, leveraging the OAuth to client credential flow. So we just have a tenant ID, client ID, and client secret here. And just so that we don't have to necessarily hard code the values inside of the plugin or have to, I don't have to type it in or paste it into the secure configuration inside of the plugin registration. On the Azure Active Directory side, we have an app registration that we're going to use in order to basically authenticate to the Graph API. So basically a service principal. And one of the key permissions we need to the Graph API is we need user.read.all privileges. So this is an application level privilege that does require admin consent in order to do that. So you can read anyone's profile. And as well, this is my profile that we're going to use kind of as a test bench. So we have we can see in here, we have the department as IT and the office location as Seattle West that we want to have synced to our user profile inside of Dataverse once we've put together the plugin. So we'll jump over to our Visual Studio 2019 environment. So I've already got a solution in place using the Power Platform Tools solution template. So out of the gate, it gives you a CRM package that many of you are probably familiar with if you ever used the older version of the Visual Studio tools. We've got just a customization project, which would be for holding your metadata. And then we've got a separate .NET 4.6.2 class library for holding our early bound types so that we can use early bound types inside of our plugins. So with that, let's jump over to the first method of creating a plugin package, and that's going to be the PAC CLI. So you can get the PAC CLI either downloading it directly, or if you happen to have the Visual Studio or the Power Platform Tools extension for VS Code, it'll actually come with the PAC CLI. So whichever you prefer, you can get it. But I'm going to open up my terminal and let's do a PAC help just to see what kind of commands we have. And so first thing we want to make sure is that we have at least version 1.17. So we're good here. We have a couple of versions ahead, which is great, but we could do a PAC install latest if we wanted to get the latest version. So in order to create a plugin, so we would use the PAC plugin. So let's do a PAC plugin help just to see what commands we have available. So we have init and push, and so init is what we're going to use to actually create a new plugin class library inside of our directory. So let's go ahead and do a PAC plugin init help and see what arguments we have available. We have the PAC plugin init help. Did I do that right? There we go. So we see you have a number of different arguments here. And one of the main ones I want to draw your attention to is the skip signing parameter. So one new benefit when working with dependent assemblies or plugin packages is that we no longer have to sign the assembly. And actually, it's typically recommended not to, because if you are going to be signing your assembly, then any other dependent assemblies inside of the plugin package also need to be signed. Otherwise, you'll get an error when you register the plugin inside of the plugin registration tool. So we also have a couple of other parameters, such as the optional author. We can set the name of the author for that, and it'll set it in our plugin, our NuGet package, and also our plugin project, and then our output directory where we want to create it. So let's go ahead and initialize a new project here. So I'm going to do a PAC plugin init. So O for the output directory. So we're going to call our project Dataverse Summit.PAC CLI plugins. I'll put myself as the author, and then we'll specify the SS alias for skip signing. Okay, so now we can see that the class library was successfully created. So let's jump over to Visual Studio and add that project into our solution. So we'll go ahead and add that. And we can see if you've ever created a plugin project via this way before, you're probably familiar with the things it gives you out of the box. It gives you a plugin base class, which is quite nice for those that are not using a plugin base class. It helps reduce some of the boilerplate code that we're always including in all of our plugins. So it helps save on that. Although I'm sure many of you have already been using your own sort of implementation of a plugin base class already. So I'm not going to spend time really talking about that. It gives you a default plugin or a plugin class by default. It calls it plugin 1. So let's go ahead and just actually rename that right now. We'll give it a pre-operation because that's the step we're going to register it in on the user entity in the update message, and then we want to update specifically the department attribute. So let's just call it that and rename all the references. For the sake of brevity or time, I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the plugin code right now. Then we'll walk through what the code is doing. So we've got some kind of boilerplate entry point that we're just checking for the context is there. We want to ensure that this is running on an entity so that we have the target and that the target is an entity. We also want it to only run on the system user entity, and also we want it to specifically run on the update message. So let's go ahead and correct a couple of these references. So for the system user, we will need to add a reference to our early bound types library. So we'll add that in there. We're going to go ahead and also check that we have a pre-image available in there. And the reason for that is because there's a couple of attributes that we want to check against that won't be included in the original context because we're not changing them. So particularly there's the isLicense and the Azure Active Directory object ID that we want to check for. So we want to ensure that this is triggering only on a actual user, a licensed user being updated. So we don't want like a service principal. For example, we don't need to update the information for that type of user. And so we're going in and just checking that the user is licensed. And then what we're also going to do here is we're going to have a little helper method that we're going to do to just retrieve our graph configuration that I showed you in the portal. So we want to get our tenant ID, and client secrets, and we're just going to get the default record, which was the primary name, as a filter attribute. And that'll return that object back to us so that we can now leverage it to initialize our OAuth and Microsoft Graph client. So the two things that we need in order to initialize a Microsoft Graph service client is we need a authentication provider. In this case, we're going to be using the client credential flow. So we need a client ID and secret primarily for that because this is going to be in a non-interactive format. And then we also need the permission scopes that we're going to be requiring. Now you'll notice in the portal that we set the user.read.all permissions, but when we're using the client credential grant, we want to use the .default scope so that it'll actually retrieve dynamically all of the permission scopes for the graph that we've defined inside of that application registration. So let's go ahead and fix a couple of these references. So in order to use the client secret credential, it actually is using a package called Azure.identity. And so Azure Identity is actually nice because it's an abstraction on top of the Microsoft Authentication Library or MSAL library, and it makes it a lot easier and allows you to set up that authentication with a lot less code. And so all we really need to do to initialize this object is just the tenant ID, and client secret that we've retrieved. Then we can pass that client secret credentials into the Graph Service client. So let's just go ahead and fix that reference. And for that, we need to install the Microsoft.graph NuGet package. And from there, the query that we're going to do is actually quite simple. So we're using the Graph client. We're going to query the user's API. And using sort of the Fluent method, we can actually kind of reference it or index it, a specific user, by just specifying the square brackets here, as if we're indexing any sort of collection or array. And we're going to pass in the Azure Active Directory object ID of the user that we've retrieved in the pre-image. And that'll get that the profile of the user that's being updated. And so we just do a .request, and then we can select what attributes we want to get back. In this case, we're just going to get the department. That's all we're going to be updating. And then we do a get async. And because in the plugin, we want things to run synchronously, we're just going to do the get awaiter and get results so that we can wait for that to finish before we carry on. So we'll check then if the department is actually populated. And if it is, then we'll go ahead and update the department inside of the Dataverse user table record. And then that's more or less the rest of it. Then it's just wrapped in a standard try catch. And so let's go ahead and build this project. And so once that's done building, so let's actually take a look at what got produced inside of our output. So let's just navigate to the project folder. Here we'll go into the bin, the debug, and we can see that we have a NuGet package that's now been created. It was based off of the naming that we specified when we initialized the plugin project inside of the PAC CLI. So it's the same convention. Of course, you could also overwrite this inside of your project file if you want. So if we actually take a look inside of the project file, we can see under the hood what plumbing is actually in place in order to get this building the way we want. So one thing you'll notice that specifically for this PAC CLI project, it's using a project style of the SDK format. And I just mentioned that there's a minor significance that I'll mention about that a little bit later when I'm demoing the plugin created by the Power Platform tools. But some other information that we have relevant here. So we have that package ID I mentioned, the author, which was put in as we specified in the CLI, and then there's a couple of other attributes that, of course, you can overwrite. And then the key pieces of information here is we have these package references. So we get a number of key package references out of the box, and we get, of course, the core CRM or XRM SDK assemblies. We get the framework reference assemblies, the core assemblies that will be available in the plugin runtime, and then we have this Power Apps MS Build plugin, which is used as part of this project template to build the plugin project or build the NuGet package. And then we have our two assemblies, our third-party NuGet package that we added, which was Azure Identity and the Microsoft Graph. And then, of course, we have our custom project that we've also referenced, our early bound types. Now, you'll notice that the three core assemblies that were included as part of the plugin project have this private assets equals all attribute here. And the reason for that is we don't want to actually include those assemblies that we're using at development time, because the CRM SDK and the core framework assemblies are already going to be present inside of the Dataverse sandbox runtime environment. So we don't need to deploy those. And actually, if you try to, if you didn't have this attribute and you try to register the plugin with these assemblies in them, you'd get an error upon registration. The nice thing is, I think in probably the more recent versions of the PAC CLI, this is now automatically added for us. You actually had to put these in yourself before. So that's nice, an extra thing we don't have to worry about. But it's important to understand that that's there for that reason. If there's other sort of assemblies that you're using that you only need at, say, development time, and you don't want to deploy them with your project, you would add that flag or that attribute into your package reference. Okay, so next, the other thing as well, what we can do is actually use what's called the NuGet Package Explorer to see, inspect our NuGet package to see what contents are in it to make sure it looks as we expected. You can install this directly from the Microsoft Store, which is nice. So let's go ahead and open that plugin package that we created. And now we can extend the lib, and so we can see we're running framework 4.6.2, and then we can see a whole list of the assemblies included. There is quite a few dependencies that come also bundled with, Azure.core and the Microsoft Graph API. So there's quite a few extra things that get added as a result. So that's nice. You can see that, and you notice that we don't see any of the SDK, XRM SDK, Microsoft XRM SDK or core assemblies included in there. So that's good. So we shouldn't have any issues when we're actually deploying this. So now in order to deploy this into our environment, we're going to use the plugin registration tool. And inside of that, we can use the PAC CLI for this. So probably in relatively recent versions, they did also add the PAC tool, which actually allows you to see what of the core Power Platform tools are available. So we have like the plugin registration tool, configuration migration tool, and the package deployer, for example. So if we do a PAC tool list, we can see what's installed and what versions that we have. And so we saw that version 9.1.0.155 is installed, and that's actually the exact minimum version that we need in order to deploy plugin packages into the environment. So that's good. We don't have to install that, so that's good. So we can just simply do a PAC tool PRT, and that's going to actually launch our plugin registration tool for us. Let's make that a little bit smaller. There we go. So let's go ahead and connect to our Dataverse environment. Hopefully it's not spinning too long. We've already logged in before, so shouldn't have to prompt us for logging in again. So there we go. And now, so you'll one thing you'll notice that's with this new version of the PRTs that we now have additional option to register. We have what's called a register new package. And so what we're going to do is click that, and we just simply need to upload the NuGet package that was built inside of our, as the build artifact from our plugin project. So we'll go ahead and select that. We can choose what solution that we can put it into, which is nice. So we ensure that we get the proper publisher prefix and it's not ending up in the default solution, for example. So we're going to choose our Dataverse Summit demo, and we can see the name, the schema name of the plugin package that's going to create, and then of course we have version 1.0.0 that it read from the NuGet or the project file. So let's go ahead and import, and if assuming we've done everything correctly, we haven't included any assemblies that are part of the core framework that's part of the runtime already, it should register without any issues. We also, of course, need to ensure that any of your dependent assemblies, of course, are compatible with the version of .NET that we're running. I think that goes without saying, but just so you know. So as long as you have, again, compatible references, that also should register without an issue. Okay, so we can see that it's done. And if we actually go into our View tab, we can also now display by package. And we can see that by default in our vanilla Dataverse environment, Microsoft has their own plugin package, so they're already using this feature, as you can see today. And we have our own one that we've just registered inside. And inside of that, we have of course, our plugin assembly, and then the actual plugin itself that we've registered that we've included along with it. So next, let's go ahead and register a new step against it. So we're going to use the update message, and we want to do this against the system user table. Let's set a filter attribute. We only want this to trigger when I actually set that plugin trigger toggle that I created for just the basis of testing. Yeah, we'll just leave all of this as it is. We want to run this in pre-operation, and we want this to run as a synchronous plugin. So let's go ahead and register that step. And what we also need to do is register a new image. As you recall in our code, we needed that pre-image in order to retrieve the isUser licensed attribute and the Azure AD object ID of the user. So let's go ahead and give it a name and alias of users. And for now, we'll just add all the attributes, but of course, typically you'd only add the attributes that you want to. So let's go ahead and register that. And so now we can see you can see now the hierarchy now is we've got that one extra layer at the top. So we have the package, which will have a plugin assembly, and then one or more plugins, and each of those plugins may have a number of steps, and the steps may have a number of images. So let's hop over to our Maker portal and refresh our solution here and just take a look at what's actually changed and been deployed. So if we jump back into all, so we can see we have a couple of new components in here. If it'll actually go ahead and load. Okay, perfect. So we notice that we have our plugin assembly here, and we also now have a plugin package type. So that's now will be able to also be deployed as part of your solutions into a downstream environment. Excellent. So let's go ahead and now actually test it to see that our plugin's working. So as you recall, in my profile, I had the department that we want to get, in this case is IT. So ideally, if we hit our plugin trigger and just simply navigate away and trigger this save, it should fire our plugin, and hopefully, we can see now that the IT department has been fetched from the Graph API that we were able to use by including the dependent assemblies and using the Graph API. And as you saw inside of the code, it was a lot easier to use a, again, out-of-the-box SDK and library provided by Microsoft, rather than having to write all of this plumbing ourselves. For example, having to write, our own HTTP clients, and then having to manage the OAuth authentication. We'd have to build our own helper library for that. Again, a lot of repetitive and boilerplate code that we could just avoid if we can just leverage these libraries. So that's excellent. So with that, let's now also try to replicate a similar plugin, but doing it via the other method, which will be via the Visual Studio Extension Power Platform tools. So in order to do that, we'll go into our extensions and manage it. And so we'll just search online for Power Platform tools. And hopefully it doesn't give me an issue. I know sometimes the search seems to bug out. Let's see if it behaves with me today, or maybe I'm not just being very patient. Well, it would come up in here if you are. And as a reminder, I mentioned earlier that you need to be using Visual Studio 2019 because it's only compatible for that version at this time. So if you're wondering why you're not finding it in Visual Studio 22, is that it's not supported yet. So make sure you're using 2019. And so you would just simply be able to install that extension. In my case, I already have it installed. So with that, let's go ahead and create a new plugin project. And if we type in Power Platform, we can see the different Power Platform templates that get installed for us when we install the extension. So we get, for example, the solution template, which is what we're already using right now. You have things like a package deployer project, customizations project, custom workflow activity. We want a plugin library object, plugin library project, so let's select that. Let's give it a name of Power Tools plugin. And we want to make sure we're using 4.6.2 as our framework. And let's go ahead and create that. Okay, so you'll notice that there's a slight difference in the templates, the plugin project template created via these extension versus using the CLI. Hopefully at some point Microsoft will align these, but yeah, for now you'll notice that there'll be some differences. For example, even the plugin base class is actually slightly different. The project itself is also made in a slightly different way. I mentioned with the CLI project, when I looked in the project file, it was using a SDK style format. So the Power Tools, or the template using the Power Platform tools, is using a non-SDK style. So there's some subtle differences with that, especially when it comes to building NuGet packages, which I'll run into once I'm further along in the demo here. But also we get a number of references out of the gate, which is the the core SDK, XRM SDK, which is good. We don't get a plugin class though, but that's okay. The nice thing is also what's available with the extensions is a Power Platform Explorer inside of the tools. So in order to do that, you can just launch the Power Platform Explorer. You would log into your Dataverse environment, and then you would get all this different metadata that you can browse inside of here. So you got all of your tables, for example, global choices, custom APIs, plugins, and even plugin packages. So we can see the one plugin package from Microsoft and the one we created via the PAC CLI earlier. So that's great. A nice thing is we can actually create a plugin directly from here. So if we just find our user, which is where we want to end up registering our plugin ultimately again, so we can do a create plugin, and it'll bring up kind of the register new step. It's not actually going to create a new step environment, but it just uses that dialog to initialize it and create your plugin class. So I'm not going to bother filling in the filtering attributes because again, it's not actually creating the step. What it does based on sort of those selections, it'll kind of suggest a class name. We're going to just slightly modify that. We'll just call it pre-operation user update location. Again, selecting pre-operation here doesn't really do anything other than with the pre-populating of the name. So let's just go ahead, click register new step. Sure, that's fine. Again, we're not creating the actual step here. It's just going to create the, oh, actually, what I did miss there is an important step. So I'm actually going to undo that and do that once more. One thing we actually saw there was we forgot to pick which project we want to include it in. So let me just back up a second. We'll go updates, and we'll quickly go through that. So one thing we missed is this handler assembly. And so it'll detect all of your valid plugin projects inside of this solution. So we have that PAC CLI one, which we accidentally added in by unintentionally. So we want to use it in our Power Tools plugins. So let's put in that name again, and let's create that. Yep, we don't care about that at this point. And so there we go. Now we've gotten the plugin created inside of the correct project. And so once again, I'm just going to paste in the plugin code, and so that we can kind of go through it again. Add that, and this one's going to look very almost identical to the previous one, just for the simple of demonstrating the different styles of creating a plugin project. So again, we're going to be running this on the system user entity or table. And so we want to add the reference to our early bound project so that we can resolve that and use early bound types. We need to add in install those NuGet packages from Azure Identity so we can use the local version inside of our NuGet cache. Same with the graph, Microsoft.graph package. So we'll install that same version. And really, it's doing the exact same thing, except this time we're simply retrieving the office location rather than the department, which we had in our other plugin. So it's going to be more or less the exact same thing. And so ideally, if we go to build this project, it should be successful without any issues. But one thing that we actually run into is we actually get this compilation error. And it's mentioning here that the version of .NET SDK used by this project is insufficient to support reference to libraries targeting .NET Standard 1.5 or higher. Please install version 2. Higher of the core SDK. So why are we getting this one? So the reason for that is actually because if we look at the Azure.identity package that we've added, it's actually primarily targeted towards .NET Standard 2.0. And while it does have backwards compatibility with .NET 6.2, it does give us a complaint about it when we try to build our project. And I guess, the reason for that, I guess, is because there's that subtle difference I mentioned about the project style that the plugin project is created. So if the CLI, it's using the SDK style, whereas if we looked at the actual project file on this one, so I'm just going to unload it so I can modify the project file. I have to navigate directly to it, and let's bring it up in the editor. So you'll notice that it's kind of the old classic way, classic project file. So luckily there is kind of a workaround to fix this. We actually just need to add in an element inside of our property group here. So let's add it in into, let's see here, just right at the end here, just called depends on .NET Standard equals false. So we just need to save that. Let's reload our project. Reload the project. Oh, what is it trying to do on me now? Oh, that's not what I want. I swear this didn't happen to me earlier. So let's see if it'll. Well, all right, let's give it a moment. It seems to be persistent on installing this plugin. So kind of in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, let's see, how are we doing on time? Okay, we're still doing fairly good, which is good. So as I mentioned, so we just need to add in that slight workaround. Of course, another thing is I could just simply not, depend on .NET Standard frameworks. To be safest, we would ideally want to use .NET Framework 4.6.2, that is primary targeting. But we wanted to really use the Azure Identity NuGet package in this particular project. We could have used the Microsoft Identity Clients library, the MCell library, that the Azure.identity is built on top of, but again, it saves a lot of that extra abstraction, saves us quite a few lines of code. So we're just going to go and use that. And so if this, Okay. Let's see, let me just double check that. Make sure we put this in the, I see what happened. Okay, we accidentally missed a closing in our XML or our closing element. So that's probably what it's complaining about. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, whew, we're all good. Could have been a potential disaster. So now let's go ahead and build it, and we can see now that we no longer have that compilation error that we saw earlier. So excellent. And so now in order to deploy this, we actually have now this deploy option directly in the context menu of the project. So we can just simply do a deploy, and right, because I relaunched, I now need to connect again to my Dataverse environment. So I'm just going to do that very quickly. Give it a second. And then really it's the first time it's going to go ahead and deploy it, and we'll see kind of in the output window here the result of that once it's done. So once we've connected to our Dataverse environment, we'll go ahead and retry that operation. I haven't been monitoring the chat. Do we have any questions up at this time that maybe I can answer while we're waiting for this to come back?
Hi there, Chris. Okay, just taking a look at the questions here. Right, okay. So the first question is, okay, sorry, that's not a question, that's a comment. The next one is by Aldo asking, is the debugging troubleshooting the plugin the same as it has been with the plugin profiler?
Right. So actually, that's one of the limitations I'll mention kind of in my slide deck. But currently, right now, you're not able to use the plugin debugger, the plugin debug profile to do that. It is one of the limitations, though, that Microsoft intends to address before general availability. So yes, ideally, you should be able to debug plugins the same, I think, although we won't know until, of course, they make that available and actually get a chance to try it out.
Thank you.
Any others? Oof, this is really taking its time.
Yes.
Good thing we've got extra time.
Yeah, cool. So Coughlin is asking, with the new package-based approach, can we deploy individual plugin classes from VS using the Power Platform Tools approach? If you right-click on the plugin class, you should get a deploy option. Just want to check if it still works.
Oh, so that was the deploy option that I was just showing here previously, and by deploying a single plugin assembly that way, you mean, or do you mean an actual single plugin class? I'm a bit unsure what the question is quite asking.
Class, sorry, yeah.
Okay, good question. I think it ends up having to be bundled with the plugin assembly, and then the plugin assembly is going to be tied to a single plugin package. So I haven't tried it, and I'm not certain off the top of my head that if you can deploy it individually, but it's a great question. So let's go ahead and actually just try deploying the entire now plugin assembly and the plugin package. And so it's probably going to think for a second while it does that. And ideally, we should see some sort of output once it's done doing its thing. So it doesn't quite give us a friendly indication that things are happening, but oh, perfect. So we can see that the registration of plugin package, so we can see it gave it the name of Dataverse Summit.PowerTools plugin. So notice it gave us a prefix, also the solution that we're in, and then the project name. And it was successful. And you'll notice that it'll always look for it inside of this bin, inside of the output packages directly. And notice it was slightly different than versus the CLI approach, where it actually just created directly inside of the bin debug directly or build or the release folder. But in the case of the Power Platform Tools project, it actually creates it inside of the output packages, a separate directory for that, and finds it in there. So I mentioned that because I've actually tried to use the same deploy context menu on the CLI, but it actually will complain if it doesn't find it It'll look specifically inside of that output packages, but in theory, you should just be able to simply add it, create that folder and add it in there, and it might work. Although again, because the SDK styles are different between the two project types, I haven't tested or confirmed whether that'll actually work or not, but something actually interesting to try to see if it works. Let's jump back to our Power Platform Explorer and refresh the plugin packages to see if it indeed deployed. And yes, we can see that it's there. That's good that we can see our package and the actual assembly and then the plugin. And then now we can actually hop back into the plugin registration tool and refresh, and we should also now see our new plugin package inside of the registration tool. And so we'll give it a second to fetch the new assets. Okay, so now we can see, yep, the Dataverse Summit.PowerTools plugins is there. And so now we can go ahead and register a new step. So we'll do the same thing as we did previously. We're going to do it on the system user table on updates. We'll filter to just trigger on that plugin trigger field that we've added for testing. We'll execute it second because we already have the PAC CLI plugin running first. We want it to run in pre-operation, and we want it to run in synchronous mode. So let's just go ahead and register that. And then subsequently, we'll also register that a new pre-image as we did it before. So we'll just give it user, and we'll just leave the filtering or the attributes as is, even though, of course, normally you want to filter just the attributes needed. And so now, if all was done well, we should now be able to test our plugin. So let's just hop back over and refresh our solutions once more just to see that it's now also reflected inside of our solution, inside of our target environment. And so now we can see we have now 6 instead of 4 components. So yes, we have the new Power Platform or Power Tools plugins assembly and the associated package. So that's great. So let's just hop over now and try to trigger our plugin again. And if all goes well, we should now also see our office location, which would be Seattle West. So let's give it a go, and fingers crossed. Probably a little slow for the first time after deploying, but should hopefully run faster after it's been cached. And so now we can see that the office location is now being populated. So excellent, our demo was successful. So that's great. So with that being said, we've got about 20 minutes, although I was maybe originally potentially intending to test some ALM portion of it, but depending on the day-to-day, sometimes it may take an ungodly amount of time to import the solution, and I was having some challenges actually deploying plugins or deploying the plugin package this week. So I'm not sure if anyone else here that's been trying with it was also experiencing a similar issue by just doing the export and import. But let's jump back to the slides just to go through the rest. So some limitations. So one of them I spoke to already with one of the questions is that you can't debug using the plugin profile currently, but this limitation, along with all of these other ones except the final one, should be addressed by general availability. So that's great. So for example, not being able to register asynchronous plugin steps, that's obviously a big one. You want to be able to run things asynchronously, not just synchronously. Another major one too, which is also has to do with deploying the solutions, that you actually can't currently include the plugin registration steps inside of the solution. So if you export it, that's fine, but when you try to import it, it'll complain. And although I was still experiencing challenges deploying the plugin project, even without the plugin steps some registered inside of there. So maybe there's a bug or issue, or maybe something I might have missed, but I was still seeing some of those challenges. The plugin package does have some size limitations. So there's, I think, the same. I believe 16 is still the same limit for just a regular plugin assembly, if I'm not mistaken. But then also there's a limit on the number of actual assemblies included inside of the package. So I'm not sure how many quite I had there in my first example, but actually coming up, that seems like that's got to be more than 50. So I'm not sure what exactly that 50 assemblies aligns to, if that's just 50 plugin specific assemblies, or if that's just dependent assemblies, although again, the documentation is a little bit vague there, so maybe we'll get some clarification there eventually. Currently, you can't register on can't use dependent assemblies with custom workflow activities, are not supported at this time. Hopefully, though, that will be the case eventually, but as of right now, we can't, so we have to stick to just using plugins. And then one final thing is that it was mentioned in the earliest versions of the docs that you could actually add in additional files inside of your plugin project or your package project, like such as a localized resource strings file or some other file, but Microsoft's now, I guess, clawed this back and said that they are not going to be supporting this going forward in GA because they can't confirm it's going to be available in the runtime to be accessible. So they've clawed that back. So for those that have been trying that, something to be aware of. Some additional things to consider as well when you're using these. Obviously, the first and foremost that this feature is still in public preview. I don't think there's been a date announced just yet on when it's GA. So keep that in mind that you shouldn't be using this for production scenarios, though I do definitely highly encourage everyone to start trying this, as eventually it's kind of going to be the recommended go forward approach that you should be using a plugin, a NuGet package to deploy your assemblies, even if you don't currently at the time of design have any dependent assemblies. That way, if you decide down the road as you're iterating or enhancing the plugin that you do need to add an dependent assembly, you don't have to go in and recreate the project structure or create a new plugin project to accommodate that. And the reason I mention that too is because there's also no migration tool planned at this time to convert from the old plugin project style to new. So you'll want to make sure once this does go into general availability that you will want to make sure that you set up to use a plugin project right off of the start so that you don't have to make any changes later on. They haven't mentioned any plans to get rid of the old style plugins just yet, just using the assembly. But of course, we know that could change once it's probably gone GA. We'll see if there's any announcements around that. There was one thing I realized I forgot to mention and show you while we were going in and creating that plugin project inside of using the extension. There's one piece that you also need to do to ensure to create a package project after you've installed the extension. So we actually need to go into our options here. We would then go into the Power Platform tools, and there's this tick box right here that we want to use NuGet package for deploying plugins to Dataverse. So if you don't have that checked, it's not gonna create a NuGet package when you build your project, just a regular assembly. So yeah, make sure the first thing you want to do is have that checked off. But of course, again, if you don't want to have that checked though, if you're going to be using that plugin in a production scenario, because again, it's still in public preview. So just keep that in mind that you might have to toggle that on back and forth if you're just developing projects or new plugin projects just to try the feature versus building production ready plugins that you'll have to be aware of how that plugin is going to be built. Sorry about that, missing that step. So with that, in order to learn more, again, you just have the documentation up right now, so you can go to the learn.microsoft.com at this path here, and it'll cover most of what I talked about today. Talks about some of those limitations, but of course keep watching that to see any updates they make throughout MGA, such as removing some of those limitations or adding additional features. There's also a couple of nice blog posts out there as well that others have done as well prior to me that have done a pretty good job as well going through this similar process. So I encourage you to check those out. If I do believe this recording will be available though, so feel free to check out this recording after, but also refer to some of those blogs as well. So with that, we've got 15 minutes, but that's good. I have ample time to answer any sort of questions that you guys may have. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay, do we have any
questions in here? Yep. I think the first question is by Phil, who is asking, actually, no, Aldo was asking the question about how do you configure the solution package for not including the unit test project?
The question is, how do you configure the solution package for not including the unit test project? So I guess, well, ideally your unit test project is going to be a separate project than your actual plugin project, if I'm not mistaken. So ideally, you're just going to be building and deploying the actual plugin assembly in that package that's going to be tied to that assembly class. I'm not sure if that quite answered the question there, but ideally, you're just building the main plugin assembly project and not building necessarily the unit test project, including it with it.
So Michael,
unless I've misunderstood.
Yeah, that's fine. Michael's asking the question, what is your opinion, pros and cons for the 2 dev deployment options, Chris, in terms of manageability and productivity?
Yeah, so I personally probably like the PAC CLI approach because again, they are keeping both up to date, but it is using the newer SDK styles I mentioned, for initializing the project, and so that allows them to use the newer tools like the .NET CLI to actually build and create the NuGet package. And you can see that the project file also looks much more similar. Now, not that you should have to spend too much time inside messing with those project files, but there's also just the fact of, it comes down to personal preference. I kind of prefer to work on this command line interface because also if you ever have to automate this in your ALM, it'll probably be more familiar and you can leverage the PAC CLI directly inside of your ALM. So if you're wanting to go further and deploy this, which again, I didn't get a chance to really cover today, but I think there'd be more opportunities with the PAC CLI directly in there rather than doing it via the GUI base. But again, it really comes down to personal preference. And one thing I'm imagining, if they haven't already done, but I haven't quite tested yet, is if also the solution packager will have kind of that opportunity to map the NuGet package directly as your solution component. I imagine they plan to add that support in, but another thing to consider when you look to start automating your ALM pipelines and including those projects directly and building from your source code rather than, again, having to include them manually via the solution itself and not having to check those in as well.
Okay, so the next question is by Cochran, is asking, custom API is a plugin, so I assume it is supported?
Yes, I believe so. I haven't tested this personally yet, but because by virtue of custom API is really a plugin, so it should work, but I have not tested it, so I can't speak to whether any sort of issues will arise. But yes, as long as it's not a custom workflow activity, it's a plugin, it in theory should work.
Any indication as to when it could go GA? 6 months or a year or more?
It's always the $1 million question that comes to Microsoft release plans, is we always know that they could always delay features or even sometimes remove features, though this one seems like quite a big feature. So I do imagine there are probably a lot of under the framework, development to support this kind of major feature. So, I imagine it might take a little bit of time, but the fact that it's already in public preview, I imagine most of that plumbing is already done because that is quite a significant effort. But, fingers crossed it'll be sometime I'm hoping within the next year. But again, of course, I can't speak to that because, as we all know, with Microsoft release waves, there's always uncertainty around that. So, your guess is as good as mine at this point.
So Philip's asking PAC CLI updated more frequently. Geordie is saying the unit test project is not a dependent assembly. It's the other way around. The unit test project depends on the assembly. So yeah, Michael is saying great section. So Michael Randrup is saying great session, Chris. Everything is clear now as snow.
Thank you. I like that pun because I'm Canadian. I see what you did there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Philip is saying I've tested custom API. It works for me.
Oh, excellent. Thanks for jumping in, Phil. See, I'm glad all the different community experts are in here because I know some of you have definitely been playing around with this probably just as much or maybe even if not more than I have. So awesome. Thanks for answering that, Phil.
So thank you so much, Chris. That's the last of the questions and lots of great feedback. Cochran saying it's great session, very useful. Thanks a lot, Chris. Voina is saying, oh, here we go. Final question from Voina, who's asking, any idea why it is not supported for the custom workflow activity yet?
That's a good question. I don't quite know the reason. Obviously, there's some subtle differences between custom workflow activities. And I imagine, plugins are the more used at this point. Custom workflow activities are kind of falling out less in favor because of Power Automate, of course. Not to say that they're not still used today because of those synchronous scenarios, but I imagine Microsoft is just tackling the plugins first because they're the most in use. But again, I believe they mentioned inside of their docs, and we can just double check the known issues, if that is something they plan to address. Okay, so it's not mentioned here, but it was mentioned about workflow activities. Yeah, workflow extensions are not supported. So I'm not sure if they do plan to support them. So it'll be interesting. So I guess we'll have to just kind of wait and see when they go GA, if they do plan to add that support. But I imagine the main reason is that they're targeting plugins first, as that's the more common scenario where we're leveraging dependent assemblies. So but otherwise, your guess is as good as mine at this point.
Great. Okay. Just some comments about that. About some thoughts, really, just to people sharing their opinions, really, around the rationale behind that, around the workflow foundation, and yeah. But anyway, I think that's great. I think everyone's happy. Vina's happy. Saying thank you, Chris. So I think all questions and issues have been answered. So Chris, look, thank you so much again. I don't know what time it is there in what time is it there, by the way, in Canada?
Almost noon hour, so I'm almost ready to get some lunch in me. So nice. It's perfect timing.
Awesome, perfect. Right, yeah. It's late in the evening here now. It's almost 7 p.m. So I just want to thank you for actually really closing off the event on a good topic, very timely. You're very well presented, Chris. So thank you so much for that. You really were really good with the flow of your presentation. So I want to thank you, Chris, and I want to thank everyone. Really, yeah, thank everyone who's joined the event over the course.